Hello and welcome to another Bitesize Brexit podcast brought to you by MHA Larkin Gowan. My name's Chris Scargill and I'm a business advisor at MHA Larkin Gowan, and we've been putting together a series of podcasts around the issues of Brexit. But one of the things that's really come out in the main as a result of the Agricultural Act 2020 is there's some major changes taking place. So we're going to focus again on that agricultural bit. So the only person I can think about asking today along again, once again, is my muddy boots guy, and that's Laurie Hill. Hi Laurie, how are you?
Hi Chris, yeah, not too bad. Glad to be back for another version.
Yeah, we're here again, and again, for as far as timeline is concerned, we still haven't got a Brexit deal going on, so at least we're able to talk about something that's fairly solid, although there's some grey areas, I think. And today we've actually got a special guest you've brought along, Tom Parish, who's head of the rural team for Savills, that well-known property consultants and agents. So hello, Tom, and welcome.
Hello, Chris. Hello, Laurie. Thank you so much for having me.
That's all right, you're welcome. Now, just tell us about yourself, Tom.
Thanks, Chris. As you say, I look after the rural team for Savills in Norfolk. That's the team of sort of 15 or 16 who do all the sort of the rural property work under the sun, from management to consultancy, agency. So that's the transactional side, as well as food and farming. So that marries quite well in with sort of Laurie's muddy boots as far as MHA Larkin Gowan is concerned.
Excellent. That was a useful introduction, Tom. So something that I've been thinking about concerns what might be happening with land prices. So what factors are currently affecting land values?
Sure, Chris, that's a great question. I think the truth is we've probably got more factors than ever before impacting upon the land market, certainly in my time. I mean, your Brexit bite-sized podcasts, capture a lot of that around the Agricultural Act, and that uncertainty that comes to bear for farming businesses with the delinking of direct subsidies and the uncertainty around what that new agricultural policy will look at. We've obviously had a relatively extraordinary year as far as everything that's happened in the wider world. We're sat talking to each other on Teams, which we almost certainly wouldn't have been doing 10 or 11 months ago. But that COVID-19 has had sort of positives and negatives on the market. And actually, one of the really interesting positives has been a sort of flight to, especially residentially and amenity-led farms and estates. And there's some great examples of money coming into Norfolk, of money coming into that part of the market, which probably we didn't know was there 10 or 11 months ago. And there's some other factors. I mean, capital tax has long been an important component of why people have invested in land, and the potential reform of that has been something which is occupying buyers and sellers' minds. When you look at what might happen to CGT on people coming into land, especially, and IHT on the way out, and sort of, I suppose, certainly, the trade piece probably affects us in East Anglia as much as anywhere else, because we're good at production. We're lucky to have this great quality agricultural land around us, and some really good sort of agricultural and food production businesses. So that, what the trade deal looks like is going to impact upon the sort of businesses that you and I get involved in.
Yeah, and you touched on there the capital taxes aspects, capital gains and inheritance tax. Any thoughts on that, Laurie?
Well, in terms of I'll touch on the capital gains to start with, because there was more recently than obviously the IHT comments that I'll come on to, but the ODS report that came out not too long ago is considering fairly substantial changes within the capital taxes side of things. Especially one thing that does link in with IHT is the tax-free uplift. So on death, you would usually get a tax-free uplift to probate value, which when it comes to farmland, with such high values as they are now, especially compared back to sort of 2000 time, when it was £3,000 an acre, to what it is now at average of around 7.5 to 8 or so. And obviously, correct me if I'm wrong there, Tom, but I think that sort of things of passing land down a generation, though for those who aren't interested in farming, often get that bonus of getting the tax-free uplift and then selling after receiving the land down a generation and obtaining the benefit. So that might disappear, and and then sort of flowing through into the IHT and the all parliamentary review back in January this year, before all the COVID hit. They're considering abolishing APR, which obviously is a significant tax relief that farmers and landowners receive, in favour of possibly bringing in a standard percentage charge. There's talk of 10% or 20%, sort of 20% being the level which people might not consider to tax plan as much. But I think that would be a significant burden on farmers and landowners if you're sort of passing down a generation, a value of an estate worth 10 million and paying 10% on that. You've got to pay £1 million of tax. Yes, you'd be able to pay it in 10 years of instalments, but I don't know many farmers and landowners who have a spare 100,000 each year.
No, certainly not. I mean, the risk, I suppose, Tom, is that we might see some businesses having to sell off small parcels of land in order to pay the tax, and then it starts this sort of fractionalisation of the farms that have been built up over many years. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, inevitably tax changes will bring a different focus on sort of structure, the structure of business, and then sort of lead to potential structural changes. But the values recently have been actually quite robust, underpinned by quite tight supply. So you're absolutely right. An increase of supply, especially for sort of say, that sort of block you described, 100 or 200 acres to put a farm or estate in a position to be able to pay a tax bill and move on with a clean slate. That will, the supply of more those sort of things to the market will inevitably have an impact on value. That almost certainly will be quite localized, and there's a big variance in the market at the moment. That's one of the real trends. So knowing the nature of your asset and where it is really important to understand what the value may be. And on that scale, it's very linked to the neighbouring farmers and businesses and what their appetite may be at the time.
And I mean, again, it's something I wanted to ask later on regarding part of the ELMS factors coming here. But again, do you see a change in the nature of farming? At the moment, you can gain agricultural property relief for letting land. If that is diminished, are we going to see more contracting taking place and a push towards that contracting, or do you think that would be tackled as part of the same thing?
I certainly think the majority of dare I say well-advised sort of farms and estates will be looking at what the BPR and or business property relief and agricultural property relief sort of scenarios are as part of their tax planning, I'm sure. Agricultural property relief in particular comes to bear if you're an estate, especially, which has a relatively a significant let portfolio. So that and there has been for probably 10 or 15 years or so a real focus on where possible, looking at revising those agreements to provide some more comfort as far as surrenders and regrants or restructuring AHA to provide some more comfort under APR, and where possible bring in BPR. Trading is going to be really, really important, and the balance of the residential property within the mix and what from a balance sheet and how people diversify, all really, really crucial in terms of how they'll move forward.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that, Laurie?
Interestingly, Tom was talking about the trading mix and the element of BPR, because the Balfour case is the 50-50 element of 50% trading, 50% non-trading. But there is possible consideration of whether that 50-50 split may go up to 80-20 or 75-25. So it's making sure that any necessary tax planning considers that possible change may come into play. And obviously that might scupper current plans as they are, so they would then need to be revisited. It's definitely a key point within tax planning, and depending on how you set up your structures, whether you're whether you're a large estate or a small farmer.
Mm. And this is a Brexit podcast, Tom. So you touched on deal or no deal. Do you think that a deal or no deal will have an impact on land prices themselves?
God, that's a good question, Chris. I think if they do, it's likely to be relatively short term and more in terms of a hiatus than necessarily a lasting impact. The fundamentals of a relatively tight supply against what has historically been perceived as a safe, tangible asset class, I think remain as we speak today. Supply in 2020, in a pretty exceptional year, has been tighter than ever, well below the 5-year average. And there is demand, especially for units of scale.
Mm-hmm.
So if you that almost a unit which is productive and has scale, and may have infrastructure, especially if we're talking in Norfolk as far as say irrigation or things like that is concerned, it insulates itself against a lot of these factors we've been talking about. Whereas if you have at the other end of the spectrum a block of land, you're much more susceptible, or the value of that is much more susceptible to localism and the pressures on particular businesses.
Any thoughts, Laurie?
I'd sort of go on the lines of yes, the land supply, or from what I've read and interestingly, Savills do a very good report on land that comes to market. But obviously there is a number of sales of land and estates that don't necessarily actually reach the market and are privately sold. I certainly have, as my family are involved in farming ourselves, we hear of various deals that never actually hit the market. So they're therefore land being sold that doesn't hit the market obviously isn't then reported, and so we don't necessarily know what the values are being reached. And land, if I were to say that land next door to where we farm came up for sale, we'd probably pay a slight premium because it's next door to us. Whereas someone who was coming from Lincolnshire or Cambridgeshire and wanted to buy some land in Norfolk probably wouldn't want to pay as much.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, do we know the prices of land in the EU, and with the exchange rates and everything else, is there still an option to make well, East Anglia, let's call it that, but also the UK, an attractive place for the EU farmer to come to? Or do you think that the barriers will now come up and we'll put those people off coming here? What do you think, Tom?
Cool, that's another good question. I mean, I would, the movement of money into the UK land market is actually something which, my colleague Chris Miles was instrumental in actually when particularly the Danes came over, in the period, there was a period running up to 2008, and their land market out there was very different. They were selling at very high levels out there, came into a relatively benign market here, saw a great deal of growth, and of course a lot of them have come out the other end having made a significant amount of money. Do we expect to see that now? I think for some assets, yes, but probably not for what we may describe as almost sort of vanilla agriculture. I mean, what we've seen in some of the open market work that we've done this year is if there still is an appetite for the sort of prime sort of residential and farming estates in the UK, that generally needs scale, that generally needs, or that may need a bit of a significant dwelling, a bit of a statement, say, but certainly, interest from Switzerland, from Germany, Italy, places like that, in those prime UK assets. But that filters down to a degree because there's some quite significant foreign ownership in Norfolk as well as other parts of the country. But a lot of that's quite established. They can drive the market locally, but not necessarily across the whole piece.
Okay, so a number of factors that are going to start affecting the market, but none that are going to surprise the market necessarily. We haven't touched on the issue of the subsidies reducing to any significant effect. We've obviously got this greening coming in, and there's much talk about that, and there's a little bit more fat coming onto the bone of detail. Do you think that we're going to see any changes coming there as a result of perhaps some of the incentives for retiring farmers? Tom?
Yes, potentially. It's an interesting option, isn't it, for a farmer who may be coming up to retirement, who has got quite used to the subsidy being part of their business, and then has the opportunity to capitalise that to move out. I don't think it will have a significant impact upon values, particularly because of the subsidy is I suppose everyone knows that subsidy is diminishing. But I'm quite excited about it. I really do hope to see especially some retirement, bringing a new generation, some new blood in, some new ideas into the industry, which hasn't necessarily approached sort of retirement and succession in the way it might. And the subsidy has been part of that because it's underpinned businesses for so long.
Yeah, it has, but for a lot of farmers, it's actually made the difference between a break even and a profit, or even a loss and a break even, depending upon the years. Laurie, have you seen any discussions taking place? It's still early yet. The BPS is still in there. We're seeing the rules changing. Are you seeing anything and hearing any whispers?
Well, in terms of what was released from DEFRA I think it was on the 30th of November, a week ago or so, the new updated document is saying, so we know what's going to happen in 2021. There's going to be varying levels of decline, whether it's depending on how much you receive. So I think it's 5% up to 30,000, and then between 30 and 50 it's 10, and then above 50 to 150 is 20, and over 150 is 25% reductions. Year after that, 2022 and 23 both will see, I think, a flat rate of 15% reduction, but we don't know anything further than that as it stands. So obviously that's then going to impact farmers, but yes, they have a general understanding as to what it's going to be, and there are calculators out there online with various. I think whether Savills have one, I think they do actually. Funny enough, I was looking at it from my own business's perspective, just to get an idea as to how it might impact ourselves. Then you want to get our clients to assess what impact it's going to have on them, and then it comes down to each business and how they operate, because it will impact businesses differently, whether you're a tenant farmer or you're owner managed, fully, as in own your own land and farm your own land rather than paying any rents, because it will be interesting to see what happens over the transition period, because as BPS declines, obviously tenant farmers need to be able to make their rent payments, and whether there's a rent review within that period of time, that will then be up for consideration. And then interestingly, on the lump sum topic, for farmers to take a lump sum of BPS and retire from the industry, yes, it will bring new entrants in, which is good, brings in new ideas. But if I sit here and put my tax hat on, not yet sure whether then that will be subject to a capital tax or an income tax for By the sounds of it, I'd expect it to be more on the lines of capital taxes from a business exit perspective. But we'll see when there's more guidance that comes out, firstly from the government for how it will work, and anything from HMRC that will decide on its tax side of things.
Yeah, and again, I think there's a lot of, as I say, water to go under the bridge yet. So just before we finish for today, one of the things that I've heard being discussed, Tom, is greater potential collaboration between farms as the different strengths of each farm comes into play, with this sort of going green and the greening activity and the opportunity to maximize value from that. I mean, businesses have got to look at how they make the best of what they've got, and probably some form of collaboration will come into play, won't it?
I think you're absolutely right, Chris. I mean, I think I suppose if you start off from a sort of a business fundamentals point of view, what the reduction in the subsidy will do is force people to make I guess, a more logical agricultural decision based on the strengths and weaknesses of the land that they own or occupy. So without the subsidy underpinning it, that changes the balance of risk in terms of growing crop X or crop Y. Especially in respect of more marginal land. I think what we know as far as the sort of evolving, the ELM scheme, which is, as you say, still got a lot of meat to go on the bones, is at the higher tier. The top level of that is going to be available to people who can collaborate or can influence on a landscape scale as opposed to just on a farm scale. I mean, there's some great conservation being done through the countryside stewardship and then higher level stewardship on a farm scale, but never really has the sort of policy lever been pulled to force people to collaborate. So people joining together and working out what the strengths of their land and their business are in a mix, conservation, production, and sort of pulling that together will be really interesting. It'll be fascinating to see how the farming community tackle it when faced with the option of pounds, shillings, and pence. And I think it's really important that the likes of us are there to enable it.
Okay, no, that's. I mean, I think it's going to be a really challenging. The idea of, as you say, farms making individual decisions, maybe field by field, but suddenly, actually, this collaboration, possibly making swathes of land look differently, is going to be an interesting factor, and the landscape may look differently, and we will presumably highlight what is the better land. You'll be able to emphasize the better land over the not quite so good land. Any conversations you've had, Laurie?
Well, oddly enough, on that perspective and looking at it crop by crop, field by field, we collaborated with the tech firm Yagro as to their new analytics program that came out not too long ago that enables farmers to try and use their data better, which many farmers are probably not that keen to sit behind a desk in an office and analyse numbers. They'd much rather be sitting on a tractor. I know when it comes to harvest time in the summer, I quite like getting out of the office and going corn carting and getting away from the numbers. But if farmers understand the underlying data and the underlying figures as to how everything then reaches fruition as into a profit and loss statement, they can then understand their business better, make better decisions based on this detail, and enable their businesses to remain profitable without subsidies. I'd always look at businesses, and I look at my clients in particular and how we show things, and we always look to bring in the subsidies and the basic payment scheme just before the final profit, just so they can understand what money they're making without the subsidy.
Mm.
It really brings it into perspective.
Yeah, and if that subsidy is bigger than the bottom line number, then the farming element isn't making it. So it's going to be really challenging. And I think that There's been so much to discuss here. Land prices, I think, is going to be a question for a number of people. What way values might move and how they have moved and what they've done, I think, is a good discussion. And also, what can businesses do in the sector going forward, and what are the things that we're going to see change. So I think actually, Tom, it's been great having you here today. If we can do it again, we'll follow up on some of those points that I've just touched on. Laurie, you're always here for me, my muddy boots guy. So we'll do that again next time. And I'd just like to say thank you very much to the listener for listening today. You've been listening to an MHA Larkin Gowan Brexit bite-sized insight, but focused very much on the agricultural side of things here. You've been listening to me, Chris Scargill, him, Laurie Hill, and indeed him, Tom Parish. Thank you very much for listening. Details of what we have covered today are on our dedicated Brexit hub on our website at larkin-gowan.co.uk.